Hi, everyone. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today's Tuesday, June 21st, 2022. Happy summer solstice. For those of you that might be new to our Q&A format, this is one of those sessions where I'll take live questions from the audience. We also get pre-submitted questions left over from the last broadcast. If you ever want to ask a question or have me address the topic, you can always email us at webinar@evoketherapy.com, and I'm happy to address those during our Q&A. If you are a family member or a friend of an Evoke client, please let me know your relationship to the client. And if you're under the age of 18, if you're not an adult, if you're asking for it on behalf of a child, please let me know your age. I want to make sure that I'm speaking to the audience appropriately at the right level. So I'll take those pre-submitted questions, the questions that have left over. Any live ones that you submit will be held on to by Malia, who's moderating for me this evening, and then she'll pass them on to the broadcast as we go along. So let me get to the first question that's left over from last time. Somebody wrote, "We have been working with ourselves, mom and dad, for the past year or so, to be able to be there for our 15-year-old son who is struggling with weed usage and low self-esteem. Just recently, we found a large knife in his backpack and questioned him about it. Second time this happens. He has minimized the issue, just saying it is in case somebody attacks him when he is hanging out with his not ideal friends. What is your experience with helping teens to understand the consequences of violence, macho mentality?" These kinds of questions are difficult because um, the stakes get a little bigger when you're talking about violence toward themselves and others. And so, most importantly, finding out where he's at is about maintaining the connection. I think that's a theme I've been thinking about this week, is that when we think about behaviors, substance use, or in this case, having a knife in your backpack, even believing that you need to have a knife in a backpack and then carrying it with you, um, that these issues are symptoms of something that's going on underneath. And to get at what the issue is, there's got to be some kind of a connection with an adult. So I'm going to say this to this parent who asked this question, but to all of you, the most important thing that you can focus on is the connection with your child. That doesn't mean you have to please them and do what they want and make them happy. I'm not saying that, but finding a genuine connection to them, listening to them, learning to not become reactive emotionally to each thing that they do or say are all critical parts of maintaining a connection. Remember, connection to our children is the best thing that we can do to inoculate our children against more serious issues and symptoms. And I say this a lot, but you're gonna continue to hear it as long as I have a voice to talk. The ability to connect to your child is largely based on how much work you've done. So I would remain curious. I would be clear. I don't think it's about the lecture. And I don't think it's about what you say, or there's some kind of analogy or phrase or paragraph that I can give to you that'll make a difference. It's more about listening to them. It's more about showing up in a way that they feel safe to tell their story about where it's really coming from. And is this a more serious kind of paranoid delusion, or is this just moderate anxiety and an overreaction on his part? Is he hanging around a peer group where he doesn't feel unsafe? So it's very realistic and grounded in the reality of his context. All of those possibilities are out there. And for you to get access to what's really going on, it's about being safe enough that he'll tell you the truth. And it's important. Building that connection, or if that connection is at all frayed or has some weaknesses in it, some cracks in it, repairing it doesn't happen overnight. Changing course with a child is like turning a large barge. You can't turn on a dime. You can't turn on a right angle. You have to kind of gradually move in that direction. So as you start to do your work, as you start to become regulated, as you start to manage your own anxiety somewhere else, how you show up will eventually show to the child, demonstrate to the child that you're a safe person to talk to. If you're reactive and anxious or angry or terrified, you're not a safe person. And that might sound strange to new watchers or new listeners, because what parent wouldn't be terrified to find out that their child is carrying around a knife for self-defense, because they feel unsafe in the world. That's a pretty scary thing. So I'm not telling you, again, as I always say, I'm not saying don't feel the fear. I'm saying make sure you have an outlet to talk about that, to share that, whether that be in your 12-step support group, your parenting group, if you have mentors or friends that you trust that are farther along in this process than you are. If you have a trusted therapist, which is my preferred method of dealing with my stress and anxiety, is going to my therapist. Find a place to sort that out there. I know I say this a lot, but I kind of want to underscore this one point. If you show up to your child with the anxiety that is well deserved, if you show up to them with that and you haven't worked it out somewhere else, that's gonna leave a dent. That's gonna contribute to a disconnection, to a fractured or temporarily disconnected attachment experience. So you've got to do your work, and it sounds like you guys are doing your work. Continue to do it. Continue to be curious. Again, I want to say to every parent who's watching or listening to me, I want to say, if you feel like it crosses some kind of threshold of safety, if you have an instinct that this is a bigger problem, you've got to take more drastic measures. I'm not trying to frighten you. I'm not trying to stoke the fires of your fear and anxiety, but I have to say that because some of these things can get more serious. And that's why, again, consulting with a therapist on a regular basis can be helpful because they know your baseline. They know the baseline of the behaviors of your child, and they can give you a reality check. They can guide you in this process. So it's a big question. It's a big concern. And as always, you need a lot of support. It could mean a variety of things. Our goal is to be a safe enough person, to be an adult enough person, a capable enough person that they can trust us, that we're not going to react from our own woundedness, that we're not going to show up to their crisis with our baggage. So that's a really difficult one. I'm glad that you came and brought that to us, and I hope that helps at least to give you a start. The next question says, it's a two-parter, a little bit longer. It says, in my own work in therapy and with my children, I've been realizing that not only does the parent shape the relationship psychology of the child, but the child's innate self, not only the parent's past trauma, etc., shapes the development of the parent. An example of this, I was told by my whole family I was very calm, a calm, alert baby, easy to soothe, and slept well. Also engaged and also at times demanding. I realized on week 3 of my son's life, oh, I adore this baby and he's up every hour. Doesn't seem to have a stop valve on eating, would throw up if he nursed too much, and is way more in need of soothing and help to sleep than other babies. The years with him, extra wonderful and difficult, then shaped who I became. My strength sometimes waned. Then regained my anxieties grew at times. And my path to growth was imperative, sink or swim, better. But my point is this. It's a two-way street with parenting, and I think straight up tabula rasa idea that we come with our bag of trauma and history and simply pour that onto the child, and that determines everything, misses the incredibly complex dance between child, parent, and how each deeply influences the other's psychic development and even nervous system. A parent could look very regulated, well-boundaried, kind parent with one kid and not so much with their sibling. I wonder if you might speak to how children shape their parents. And children in these programs require a gift, really, much more conscious parenting than another for the parent-child, family parent, and hopefully child to thrive. Thank you. Sorry if I bundled that question. I think you're really asking the cause and effect, the two-way street, and the nature-nurture. There's always with human beings the given and the made, right? The given is, even if there are birth children, they come with a genetic predisposition and loading and temperament that we have no control over once the baby is conceived, once the baby is born. That's who they are. They can come with learning differences. They can come with atypical neurology, all kinds of issues, predispositions to mood disorders, difficult to soothe, difficult in transitions. All of that is true. And so really the goal of the parent is to learn how to stretch and grow. And that's why I say you need more help and support with these children often because they require something different and something more. I can relate to your story that I have 4 children who are very different. Some of them I find to be more a better match for my temperament and neurology. It's easier for me to connect to them. Others at times have a very different presentation, and I have to figure out how to relate to those too. So when I talk about the work and the parent work and what we pour into the child, I'm not talking about cause and effect. In fact, I used to have a slide years ago at the end of every single broadcast that said not cause and effect to remind me, to remind you that it's not simple cause and effect. And if a child comes with just think with health issues. Think if a child is born with obvious health issues, with colic, with earaches, how they show up is going to affect us. And over time can condition us in certain ways. That's all true. The difference is there's one way in which the parent-child relationship is not a two-way street. And I say this all the time. In one significant way, the parent-child relationship is a one-way street. And that is that it's the parent's responsibility to be the adult, to take what is given to them, which, like you said, can be very diverse and very, very different, and at times very difficult, and to gather resources emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, to be able to be there for the child. The child, even though that's a two-way street in terms of how we impact each other, the child is less responsible, if you will, for how they show up. If they think I have to show up in a different way so my parents are okay, just that phrase, just that terminology, that's a big problem. That means that the child will find that parts of themselves are too threatening for their life, for their parents. They might be abandoned or rejected or punished if they show up a certain way. And if the solution to that is to cut off and exile parts of themselves, that can become very, very damaging and harmful over time. So we have to be everything you said is absolutely true. And for empathy and understanding and compassion reasons, it needs to be said now and again that the impact is a two-way street and it's not all about the made, right? It's about the given also. But we have a different kind of responsibility than they do. Our responsibility is to be there for them and not vice versa. Now, as the child grows older, they become more accountable for their behavior, right? As they become more conscious. But most parents place too much responsibility on the child to show up for the parent. I know I have. And because of that mistake of placing too much responsibility on the child to be there for a way in ways that the parent can more easily tolerate, that thinking, that energy comes with really, really immense and dramatic costs to the child's development and psyche. So if what works well for one child doesn't work well for the next, that's your work. And their work will be, and their life will be about how to respond to your limitations. No doubt about it. That's becoming an adult, right? It's your life eventually. You can talk about the dents and the bruises from your parents, but eventually those are yours and you have to deal with them and you have to make your life something of your life. So it's about like a lot of things, there's a lot of paradox, a lot of dialectical things that seem opposite. It's so nuanced and complex that no simple model explains human development in the parent-child relationship. And that's a really important thing to acknowledge and understand and to deal with. Can you guys not hear me? Or is it too high? Is the sound too high? You can hear me, but the sound was too high. Sorry, I'll try to adjust it a little bit and see if I can adjust it. Oop, that was a lot down. Test, test, test. Boy, this is a fun one tonight, isn't it? There's a clicking. Should I leave and come back? Is that better? I'm going to leave and come back. Sorry, guys. How's it now? Malia, I can't get the private chat back. Can you get the private chat back? How's it going now? Better? You think it's better? Sorry, everyone. Thanks for dealing with the technical difficulties. I'm just going to go on to the next question then. Somebody writes, sorry about that. We'll just have to do a lot of editing to the podcast. Somebody writes, I have two daughters, one of whom lives at home and the other lives in college nearby and is frequently at home. I'm hoping you can give me some advice. Later this summer, a 16-year-old refugee from Ukraine, Angelina, will be coming to stay at our house for a while. She will likely stay about a month. I will be involved in her care while she is in Toronto as her legal custodian, and she is still a minor. I wanted to take on this responsibility because her story touched me. She is similar age to my two daughters. Also, I feel that I have something I can offer a young person like Angelina. It would give me pleasure if I and my family could help her out. I wonder if you can offer me some general advice on healthy interactions with someone like Angelina under these unique circumstances. I would like her to be comfortable enough with us to be herself and to not feel constrained in her self expression by a sense of obligation to us. My two daughters at times resent the attention I give to Angelina. You know, that's a really interesting question, interesting dilemma that you have. I think part of what comes to mind is um, if the psychology or the parenting education that I offer you all, that I've received, that somebody offers you, if it doesn't apply to every child, then it's limited, right? Like the kind of advice that I talk about is universal. Whether you have a child who's cooperative and kind of going through the life in a mainstream kind of way, to somebody who's addicted, to somebody who's on the autism spectrum disorder, to somebody who's coming from war-torn Ukraine temporarily as a refugee. The parenting principles through all of those that I talk about and teach are the same. You know, there are, of course, specific decisions that you need to make that are different with each child in certain circumstances. That's true. But the parenting principle that comes to mind first and foremost is let her tell you about herself. Let her teach you about who she is and what she needs. If anything, I think the strongest advice I would give to you, and I think it goes to, um, I think it really goes to all of you, even if you're not the one asking these questions, is don't try to do too much. I mean, I think that's a mistake that we make often as parents in our anxiety. You know, as we try to fix children, when the stakes get very high, when it's pass or fail, win or lose, when there's pressure on us. I think that kind of energy can become very, very difficult in the process. That will feel like anxiety and control. So when I think about a refugee child coming and staying with a parent for a month, I think that's the thing to focus on is don't try to do too much. The job of a parent is not to shape a child up, to impart your wisdom to them per se. The job of a parent is to embody your wisdom. Does that difference make sense to you all? Not to impart your wisdom to the child, but to embody your wisdom, how you show up. And if you show up anxious and eager, that energy will feel overwhelming and threatening to the child. When I train therapists, I say the therapist that is anxious and eager to fix the client is not an asset to the client. They're a detriment. There's got to be a certain kind of regulation of your nervous system. So part of it is just, I would focus on what lessons she can teach you. I would focus on what you can learn from her. And at the same time, the universal principle is have your boundaries. But if you start thinking about what you can do for this girl in a month, although I think you can do an amazing amount of things for her in a month, I think that's possible. But if you start to think in those terms, I think you might be gripping it too tightly. I think it might lead to control. I think it might generate a kind of anxiety, which will let her know that, it's about you. You don't want it to be about you. You don't want it to be about being a good host or being a good parent. That's work you have to sort out by yourself with somebody else. And so if you're sorting that stuff out, then you can show up for the child. Have your boundaries, have your values, lecture less. Don't try to fix her. Don't try to fix her situation. Her situation, maybe more profoundly than we can possibly imagine, is unfixable. And you need to sit in that space with her to stay connected to her. But if you try to come in and do too much, I think that's the risk. So I love your question. I love what you're doing. But remember, it's about being connected to her. It's about listening to her. It's about letting her teach you. It's about the lessons that she's going to impart to you while you still have your values and your boundaries. And it's not about imparting your wisdom. It's about embodying the wisdom that you've learned in this process so that you can be a regulated human being. It's in a way, being a healthy parent or a healthy host in this case is getting no credit, being invisible, so to speak, because the focus is on the needs of the child, not on your needs to be a good host or be a good parent or be a good therapist, which again, I spent 30 something years of my life trying to prove to the world that I was good and worthy of love and acceptance and attention. And because I didn't have that sorted out from my own childhood, I hurt people inadvertently along the way when they got in the way of that ego need of mine. But over time, through the process of psychotherapy, as I started to make some progress on healing that wound from childhood, then I could show up for other people. You see that difference? If you can heal yourself somewhere else, you can be there for your neurologically diverse child, your Ukrainian refugee child, your addicted child, whatever, your anxious child, whatever child is there. But if you don't do your work, your interactions with them will be in some part, in some way to serve you, and they will feel that disconnection. They will feel that narcissism is what it really is. Not diagnostically, it's not narcissism. You don't have a narcissistic personality disorder, but that narcissistic wounding, that childhood wound of not being seen and not being held and not being contained. So good luck to you, and I hope for both of you, for you and for her, it's a rewarding process. And I tell this to therapists too, if you're not learning as much or more from your client as they're learning from you, you're doing it well. So I would look to become a student with her. Somebody writes, please define attachment as it relates to trauma. Well, that's a broad question. So let me see if I can. You're tempting me because my propensity to just go in all kinds of directions. Attachment is founded on a self. You can only have a healthy attachment to the extent that you're a self and that you've worked out your own childhood wounding. You don't have to have it fixed. You don't have to have it completed. If that were the case, then nobody could do this work because nobody has it completely figured out. In fact, the ones that have it somewhat figured out are the ones that realize you don't have it figured out. When you start to hear people talk in absolutes, like their therapy is completed or they've graduated or they've healed this or that wound, my ear starts to hear that there's some work that's undone there that needs to happen. They don't know that they're still them. They're still struggling with it. Remember, mental health is not about getting fixed or getting better, but it's about knowing your particular dilemma and remaining on speaking terms with it. Like it said in The Godfather, I keep my friends close and my enemies even closer. We keep our strengths close, but we need to keep our weaknesses, our wounds, our issues even closer. Otherwise, they'll sneak up on us, so to speak. So attachment is having a self. Attachment is that. I love that quote that I shared maybe a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago. It's the delicate tangle of being interconnected and independent, of nurturing and separateness. I was listening to some words of Joseph Campbell today. It was amazing. A lecture, in fact, it's on my social media. It's from a set of interviews that was eventually entitled the Power of Myth, a series that was done on television that eventually became a book. And Bill Moyers said something like this to Joseph Campbell. He said, "So whatever it is that it is our experience, we have to express it in language that is not quite up to the occasion. Whatever it is that is our experience in life, we have to express it in language that is just not quite up to the occasion." And Joseph Campbell responded to Bill Moyers and said, "That's it. That's what poetry is for. That's what myth is for. That's what metaphor and symbolism and music and dance and art are for." Language is really important. That's why sometimes when you talk as much as I do or write as much as I do, somebody will point out a flaw in your thinking or your approach. Sometimes it's because there's a huge flaw in your thinking or your approach, right? That happens too. And sometimes it's because it only made sense in that very specific context. And there are an infinite number of ways to describe a flower. And so one description, no matter how lengthy, never quite accomplishes the task. So what is attachment? It's about being a self and loving another. And if loving the other's otherness means they have to be a certain way, they have to be good or right or fit within your bandwidth, then that's not really love. That's about control. So we have to expand. But we also have to be a self. I mean, that's why being a self is about expansion and growth, but it's also about being a self, having a boundary, saying no when no needs to be said. That's why it's so complex. That's why I'll be doing these podcasts for the rest of my life, most likely, because I'll never get to the end of it all. So I have several broadcasts on attachment that I would recommend to you. My books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are attachment based. Everything written by Jamie Gill, JD Gill, my therapist, is attachment based. Those are some places I would direct you to for more. Somebody writes, my spouse and I have both knee-jerk and response flexible reactions with our kids. Can you give suggestions on how to take care of the knee-jerk responses when we have them in a way that allows for the family to learn the difference? Wonderful question. Just own it. The apology that parents can make from a place of strength and courage and authenticity and love is every bit, maybe even more valuable than all the things you get right. I remember my daughter, I haven't told this story in some time, My adult daughter, after she came home from her own intensive that she participated in as a client, um, when she first shared to me the work that she had done as it related to our relationship, even though I was trained, even though I thought I was ready, I stumbled. I had some knee-jerk responses. I was able to recognize it in real time and apologize and ask her if she was willing to start again, which she was. And I felt tremendous self-judgment about that. My therapist helped a little bit. She said something like, if you'd gotten it right the first time, maybe that wouldn't even have been better, because your daughter kind of sees you as the one who always gets it right. And so getting it wrong was okay, maybe even helpful. And I told the story many times in front of my daughter for years subsequent to this discussion. And she said to me not too long ago, she said, "Dad, I never said this to you, but I'm kind of glad you screwed up, because it kind of validated my experience. If you had responded perfectly, I would have doubted myself." And what a beautiful example about how it's not about getting it right. Remember, the goal here for you and for your children is to be who you are, to be human. And humans are messy and imperfect, beautiful and tragic. They're made of stardust, and sometimes they're just idiots. And mental health is about all of that. It's about embracing all of that. So for me, how to take care of those knee-jerk responses after they happen is use them for teaching. Don't do them on purpose just to screw up. You'll screw up plenty. You don't need to contrive this. You'll screw up plenty to have opportunities to apologize. But that teaches your children maybe one of the most important lessons of all, what it means to be a human, and also accountability. Parents really want their children to know about accountability. They really, really do. The best way to teach accountability is to show them. The strongest parents can show up as strong selves that are also human. So it sounds like my what I would say to you if we were sitting across from each other is, I would say, sounds like you're already doing a great job in this process. Thank you. Next person writes, in the past year, Brad has mentioned a boundary that he has with his younger child regarding substance use because of the long-term effects it can have. For example, that she is still developing, especially in her brain. I can't remember how he words it, but she's young enough that he's going to put something in place due to the risks. Do you guys have a resource that lists side effects, concerns of marijuana use, drug or alcohol or vaping? My daughter is testing the waters and is only 14. I know that there are many sites with those types of lists, but wondering if you have one that addresses this in a more helpful way, kind of in an evoke therapy type of way. I don't. I could work on that. I don't have something simple to hand out. You know, I'm going to use your question to go in a different direction, and then I'll come back to it. So, Malia, remind me to come back to it if I don't come back to it. But I'm gonna take a departure for just a second. I like the resource for you. I don't like you having it for her, because that's about being right. That's about showing her that you're doing a good job and doing the right thing. This is very similar to a question that a father asked me some years ago, and I think I wrote about this in one of the books. I know I've told the story in the past. It's been a while. A father came up to me after a speaking engagement about parenting, and he said, "Do you have any literature on the negative effects of marijuana?" This was pre-recreational legalization of marijuana. "Do you have any references about the effects of marijuana on the brain?" And I said, I think I could get some. Why do you ask? And he said, because my young adult son he's using, living at home in the basement, playing video games, that archetype, that cliche. And I would want to show him. And I said, well, I have a different thought then. I said, why don't you just tell him that you're not okay with marijuana use? And the father said to me, that's enough. And I said, that's all you have. If you give him a article from the University of Wisconsin, I'm making that up, on the negative effects of marijuana use, the latest research, he's going to pull up an article from Cal Berkeley that talks about how marijuana use might be better at medicating ADHD or depression or anxiety than the psychotropic medication that psychiatrists are prescribing. And then you're in a battle about who's right and who's wrong. The only thing you have is yourself. I don't mind providing that. That's something I can look into. I don't mind providing you that information. But if it's about being right, you've got the lower ground. He's got the higher ground. She's got the higher ground. It's about being a self. There are other rules in the house that we have that I can't prove with a bulleted list based on research. That would be too great of a burden for me and for my wife to come up with all the time. So part of it is, yes, it's out there. We can talk about that. We can talk about addiction and the brain. Most everything that Daniel Siegel writes, the psychiatrist from UCLA, is a good resource for brain development and the effects of drugs on that. There's lots of research on introducing drugs to an adolescent brain. The research is exhaustive. Introducing regular substance use to the adolescent brain wires it for addiction, because the adolescent brain already, before any substances are introduced, it requires more stimulation for a release of dopamine. You and I can curl up with a good book in front of a fire and find joy. The adolescent needs to jump off a tower, doing a bungee jump to feel that same feeling, right? They do high risk behaviors. And then you start to introduce substances that release dopamine. And eventually the brain has to have substances or high risk behaviors just to achieve a baseline to keep the person out of depression or anxiety, right? It's very, very simple that way. So the fact of the matter is, you get to decide. The research is there, the science is there. But if you get into a who's right, who's wrong, you've lost. But remember recovery. That's the difference with recovery. When I talk about this, if you don't know what recovery is, it's people who regularly attend to their issues as it relates to being in relationship to others who are using substances typically. But it's really about all of us. But they learn that they don't get to be right. They don't get to be on top. They don't get to win a debate. See, when you're in recovery, you don't debate about who's right or who's wrong. You say, this is what my boundary is. This is where I come from. Educate yourself for sure. Read the books by Daniel Siegel, or Google the research on addiction and the brain. It's out there. But if you have to have that, or even more so, if you want to give that to the child so that they know that you're right, you've lost already. Somebody writes, we are new to the Evoke program. How is the time frame for the family visit determined? As far as the young adult sibling, should they be expected or encouraged to attend? You should start talking to the therapist about it as soon as you need to. Like they're not going to have an opinion in week 1 or week 2. Visits usually come around week 6. That's a ballpark, give or take. But if you need to plan it ahead of time because your work schedule and your life, you can bring it up as soon as you want to in the process. That's really important. In fact, we have in the parent portal prompts for you to ask the therapist about parent visits. Generally speaking, we don't have siblings come out. There's just too many variables. You introduce a sibling and all of a sudden this happens all the time. You're spending more time on the sibling and catching them up to speed than you are on the child in treatment and then the parent-child relationship that is at least in the beginning, the primary focus, the primary dynamic that we focus on. So generally speaking, no siblings, parents, primary caregivers, that kind of thing. Week 6 is on average. But if you need to, sometimes what I've done in the past, I used to do this all the time. After I figured this out, it took me a while. Parents would say, I need to plan ahead. In my world as a therapist in a wilderness program, I wish I could just decide now next week is the best time, and you could cancel all your plans, book your flights. There were no financial constraints whatsoever, and you could just be out there. But that's not the way that life works. So what I would say often to families is, let's plan a visit around week X. Maybe it's week 6. And maybe that's going to be a time to really jump into the family therapy. Maybe it's a time where your child is still struggling and you need to hold the line, and that's the family work. Maybe it's a time to celebrate and reward them for the progress. And this is the next stage in treatment, is to integrate or introduce the family work into that. We don't know what week 6 will be, but we can set the date if we need to, if that's a need that you have. But you can start talking about it. There's no one reason for a visit. There are, again, an infinite number of reasons for a visit: work, boundaries, celebration, connection, something that needs to be dealt with that wasn't dealt with well at home, something that's happening now. The iterations are numberless. So, but the date can be specified even before you decide what that visit is going to be about. Then when you get to the visit, come, ask if there's any intention about the therapist inviting you out. State that you might have an intention or two. Confess that, if you will, to the therapist so they can help you work through any of that needs to be worked through. And then come ready to learn and to listen. Coming to expect it to be a good time, or being very tied to a specific agenda, that becomes extraordinarily limiting to the experience. The most powerful and impactful visits I've ever seen have been the ones that we didn't expect or engineer. And the most challenging ones that I've seen are when the parent came hoping that it was going to be about the celebration of reunification, and because of that, they avoided difficult topics, or when the dynamic became troublesome, they felt incredibly defeated or deflated by it. So come with an open mind, and there are webinars on our YouTube channel that I've recorded before, and podcasts on all of the podcast apps, where you can go to and listen to those or watch those in preparation for the visit. There are specific ones that I've done for that, where I spend the whole hour. Somebody writes, my daughter's in the wilderness right now. I have a hard time processing and containing anger. My dad was a rager, and I learned anger is dangerous. My daughter has so much anger and typically projects it onto me. Do you have any wisdom on how to accept and honor my own anger so that I can better contain my daughter's anger, which often feels abusive and destructive? Great question. Wonderful question. For starters, find somebody that can hold your anger. Your daughter can't. Children generally cannot, or it's not ideal to ask them to contain it. They can be overwhelmed, and it feels very, very threatening. It's one of the energies that causes the child to regress into fight or flight mode. Okay, our anger is very, very threatening to the child, which of course I have used, and I'm sure a lot of you have, to try to manage my child's behavior, because if I can intimidate them into compliance, then it's easier for me. Not ideal, but that's what I've done. So find somebody who can hold your anger. There's a lot of work to uncover that. And then secondly, part of probably why she's explosive, it could be genetics, like the question that I answered earlier tonight about the given and the made. It could be that. But also, you might have a specific sensitivity and aversion to anger because of your childhood trauma, where she's not allowed to express, or it's not safer to express, what I might call typical levels of anger. Right? That could be the case. And that's something to explore and uncover. And if she's not allowed, or he's not allowed, whatever the gender of the child, if they're not allowed to express a reasonable amount of anger at times, which is going to be a little bit higher than we're comfortable with, then it can become more explosive. Ironically, it can become repressed. It can become acted out. It can become explosive at times, because you keep that energy, that feeling that's not allowed to be expressed under pressure, and it will come out in bursts, in aggression and violence. So kudos to you. Kudos to you for identifying that anger is a theme in your childhood and your life and your child's life, and then continue to work on it with a therapist. I know I've said this already several times today in the broadcast. I'm a fan of therapy. It's not that I'm recommending something to you that I'm not willing to do, as you know, unless you're brand new to the broadcast. I've been in therapy for around 30 years of my life, 23 years with my current therapist. So it's something I believe in. My wife, same thing. She's been with our current therapist for 24 years. Our children, most of the time, go to therapy because of their own volition, their own desire to go to it. They've been in and out of therapy not because we require it, but because we want to. Because we have a culture in our family that it's. I mean, when I think about it, when I'm sitting by myself and I think about it, it's the most obvious thing in the world that people would benefit from therapy. It's about unraveling who you are, figuring out your dilemmas, knowing what your dents and bruises are, knowing what your family programming is, figuring out, learning what you don't know. We don't know what we don't know, and kind of discovering that part of it. I don't care if you're a professional athlete, if you're a stay-at-home father or mother, if you're a CEO, if you're a high school math teacher, if you're a dental hygienist, if you're a wandering bohemian person, the onus is on you to figure out your life, and nobody's going to rescue you from it but you, and definitely not your children. One of the things I've been thinking about today, as I've been reading and studying today, is that we don't have to do it alone. We can get help. We can find mentors and coaches and therapists and people to help us, but we ultimately have to become the heroes in our own story. We're either the victims in our lives, or we're the heroes in our lives. And if you keep waiting for somebody to rescue you from your life, and oftentimes I think that's what we expect our children to do, is to rescue us from our pain, our anxiety, our worry, our fear, our anger. We put on them a burden that they can't possibly carry. And that's, the unlived life of a parent, Carl Jung says, is the greatest burden for a child to bear. And that's what he's talking about, what he talked about, is we have to do our work. Otherwise, we cannot help but lay on our children's shoulders the responsibility for our life and our happiness and our serenity and our well-being. And that, if we do that, that is the greatest damage that we can do to them. And to not do that and to say, I'm going to go to therapy, I'm going to get into recovery. Yes, my child has neurodiversity or addiction or a different temperament than I could have ever, designed for them. All of that can be true. But I'm going to take responsibility for my life. And I'm going to, when we conclude, it is only when we conclude that the way that we are living our lives is the cause of our unhappiness or happiness, that is the only time that we can really be free. And that's the message we want to give to our children. That's the same lecture we're giving to them all the time. You can't control what people do, but you can only control how you react to them. That's true of us as parents, to them. So, great questions and great work. Somebody writes, thoughts about somatic experiencing, embodying movement and trauma healing for parents, in addition to skill building. I've worked with therapists who are experts in somatic experiencing. It is not my language. I've seen it work in session with clients. I've seen those folks reach clients that simple dialogue couldn't quite reach. It's not how I process. I don't experience my anger, my love, my sadness, my fear, um, my hope, my grief. I don't experience it in my body so much, but that also could be a limitation of mine. I also have multiple sclerosis, ironically, symbolically, which makes my body numb, literally. And maybe there's some kind of connection to that. I don't know. So it's not the way that I do my work, but again, if that's the work that helps you to best access your emotional state. I was reading again today from one of my favorite authors ever. I'm reading a book called The Middle Passage. In fact, let me just put that out there. It's an advanced book, so if you've got some work under your belt, The Middle Passage by James Hollis, Hollis. My wife recommended it to me. My daughter's partner read it and said, "You got to read this book." I'd read some of his other stuff before, and I just hadn't read this book. It is mind blowing. The man, I think he's might be still alive. He may have passed recently. He was a genius. It was remarkable. And he talks about how there's no one right way to do this thing. Like, we all have to find our own expression, our own context where we fit, where it makes sense to us. And so, above and beyond, it's not about, for you, skill building might be the road to greater consciousness. For another person, it would be meditation. For another person, it might be somatic experiencing. For another person, it could be psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Everybody in the world is trying to encourage me to do psychedelic assisted psychotherapy as a patient these days. Everybody is recommending it. It's the new rave. It's going to be, I'm sure, much, much more mainstream. And I tell them I did a lot of psychedelics as a teenager. That's what got me into this work. I'm not feeling called to it right now, which might change tomorrow or next week or next year. But the work is about finding what works for you. And if you have a therapist that's flexible enough to work with you, then you have a therapist that you can trust. Even a somatic experiencing therapist. This is the limitation of any approach like that I have. If that's the only way, or if they impose that on you. The problem I've seen with some folks that do this kind of work with somatic experiencing or cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy, pick your model, is when the model becomes more important than the client. When the therapist thinks that their one right way is the right way, that's a fractured attachment between the therapist and the client. Then the client's agenda is superimposed over the client, and the client is essentially emotionally abandoned in the process. So I think it can, if that's an avenue you want to explore, great. And for some people, they swear by it, and I 100% support that. And I've seen it work, and I've also seen it become a preoccupation for therapists. I've seen their model become a preoccupation for them, and I felt that the client uh, deal with the dilemma that they either have to go along with a therapist like they did with their parents and make the therapist happy and feel good about themselves by validating their model, right? Which is probably a replication of the childhood wound, or to fight against the push against the therapist approach and risk the alienation and the disappointment that they might receive from the therapist, which again probably has some roots in the therapist's undealt with trauma and the client's undealt with trauma. So anytime a model becomes, except for attachment doesn't have a model. It's a way of being, right? It's not, attachment theory is infinitely flexible. Even the possibility exists in attachment theory where you could be rigid and confrontive, even though that's not the go-to or the default position. The attachment therapist will say, whatever works for you, let's find that for you. Somebody writes, how can I or Evoke support my child to feel successful at Evoke, even though she has not and will likely not access the individual and group talk therapy? She does not have the skills to talk deeply about feelings, emotions, and experiences. Well, that is the challenge, isn't it? I mean, it's the goal is to feel seen, to give them the experience of feeling seen and heard. And so if somebody's not responding well to therapy, it's our job as parents and therapists to find out why that's not working and to lean into that. Right? I've talked about this before, and this is where I'll end for this evening. The goal in therapy, in essence, is to find the client and to find the context in which the way that they're presenting themselves makes perfect sense. That means you have to have some insight into neurology. You have to have some insight into um, what is typical versus atypical neurology. You have to have some insight into family trauma. You have to have some insight into all the various systems that impact the child. Does the child have a learning difference? Does the child not want to get it, because if they get it, they will lose power with their parents. I mean, the goal is for a client to be able to tell their story. When they can't, to be able to tell the story for the child, to the parents, and to the people that are serving the child educationally and contextually, so that the child feels understood. So if the child isn't responding, I want to understand why, and I want to be able to tell that story. Part of that would just be described as an assessment or diagnostics. But really, and will be my last comment before I go on to the upcoming events, before I close this evening, it goes back to one of my favorite quotes, which I'm sure many of you have heard me say many times, by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, that if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each man's story suffering sufficient to disarm all hostility. In other words, if we could see each person's life, everything that they do, even the things that seem irrational on the surface, would make sense. And that's our job, is to see them, to find them in the context where it makes sense. All right, folks, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. Thanks for hanging in there. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. If you want to give back to people who can't afford, for people that can't afford therapy, our three charitable partners at Evoke are ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, or EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. So you can go there and give back. We have support groups online for current and alumni wilderness families and for our intensive alumni. If you are a current or alumni wilderness family, the next available offering online is June 23rd at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, or for alumni at June 28th at 6:30 p.m. is only for alumni of wilderness. For our intensives alumni, the next offering is July 12th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Contact Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information. If you'd like to do a deep dive into your own work, I cannot emphasize enough the value of what this could do for your child. What this could do for your child, for you to attend a therapy intensive as a therapy springboard into your own work, or a therapy accelerator if you're already involved in therapy. The next offering is July 14th through 18th in person, or August 26th through 28th online. Contact intensives at evoketherapy.com for more information. I will also be running the October 12th through 16th, Returning to You. That's for those folks who have already attended Finding You. If you would like a parent coach, couples coach, life coach, individual coach, we have coaches available who are trained in attachment-based therapy. Just contact coaching at evoketherapy.com. We have pursuit trips anywhere from 3 days to 30 days, customized for families or young adults. You can do it in between programs. You can do it at the end of the program. You can do it to come back and revisit. You can do it to augment your work. Think therapy light or sober fun, river rafting in southern Utah, to hiking to base camp in Nepal. All things are on the table. We have 12-step support groups that we encourage all current participants of our program, all family members, to go to if they're able to. We ask you to try 6 of these. Any combination of Al-Anon.org, Coda.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. You can also go to RefugeRecovery.org. It's a Buddhist-inspired program, less of an emphasis on a higher power. Or the National Alliance on Mental Illness. You can find by searching NAMI.org, going to NAMI.org and finding free classes and support in your local community, your local area. All of these broadcasts are available on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast. You can also go to soundcloud.com and find us there by searching Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast. You can also go to our YouTube channel, where you can see the slides that I use, the questions as they come up. You can find Evoke Therapy programs or me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter or Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy or at Dr. Brad Reedy. You can also find Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And also, we have a wonderful blog curated by Malia, who does our moderating on our Evoke website, for new information and content each week by the Evoke staff and therapists. My next and last broadcast for a month, we're going to have some guest hosts, but I'm taking the month of July off. So my next broadcast will be this Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, where I'll be reviewing the book No Bad Parts. It's a book about a model called Internal Family Systems by the author Richard Schwartz. So I'll be talking about that June 23rd at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. All right, folks, I hope this was a helpful point of contact. Again, thank you for tolerating the glitches that we had with technology this evening. Have a great evening for and on behalf of the people that love you. Thanks for attending and being willing to do your work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you in about 48 hours. Bye-bye.